So the first of the four main parts of the brain is the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is the outermost layer of the brain, and it's responsible for things that we like to call higher cognitive functions, things that make us different than animals like planning, problem solving, language, as well as some basic things like sending information to the rest of our body to initiate movements. The next major area of the brain is the limbic system. The limbic system is a collection of brain structures right here in the middle of the brain, located beneath the cortex. So they're called subcortical structures that are involved in things like memory and basic emotions. The next major area of the brain is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, this part right down here, the word cerebellum literally means mini brain, and it's called that because of how it looks like a miniature version of the rest of the cerebral cortex. And that's involved in motor coordination and balance. And last but not least, the final main part of the brain is the brain stem, and that's responsible for transmitting signals to the spinal cord, as well as regulating some very basic functions like your sleep cycle, you're keeping your heart rate going, your breathing, and your digestion going. All those things that are largely unconscious take place because of the activity of the brainstem. So there are several different ways to describe and map out the cerebral cortex. One way to describe it is to look at the physical features, such as the gyri and sulci. If you look at this diagram over here, you'll see that the brain is very, very folded. The human brain is really a scrunched up ball. And what results from that scrunching is these peaks and valleys. So the peaks are called gyri, and the valleys are called sulci, or individually a gyrus and a sulcus. And when you compare the gyri and sulci of the human brain to those of animals, you'll notice that the human brain has many more gyri and sulci in comparison to some of these other species. And that reflects the complexity of these organisms. The more gyri and sulci that you have, the more complex your functioning is. And that's because increasing surface area in the brain enables greater complexity of function. So you can think of the brain kind of like a piece of paper that's just flat. And when you take a piece of paper and then scrunch it up, there are more parts of that piece of paper that are touching each other than there were when it was just flat out. In the same way, when the brain is scrunched up and there are more folds in the brain, then more regions of the brain are able to communicate and work together. So if you compare the human brain to that of a squirrel per se, you'll see that the squirrel has very few folds in its brain, and that kind of reflects its function. They kind of just run, eat, I guess sleep. They don't have a very, very complex life. Compared to that of a dolphin. Dolphins are often referred to as one of the most complex organisms, one of the most intelligent organisms, and that's reflected in the morphology of its brain. You can see there's lots of gyri and sulci and lots of folding. Another way to describe the cerebral cortex is to look at the two cerebral hemispheres, as we talked about earlier. So we have the right hemisphere, the left hemisphere, and these are connected by the corpus callosum, which is a collection of axons spanning the two hemispheres that allows them to communicate and work together. Another more popular way to describe the cerebral cortex is to look at the four lobes of the cerebral cortex. Neuroscientists, psychologists, biologists have come together and have mapped out how certain functions, certain human functions, can be localized to one of these four large areas of the brain. And so those are the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. The frontal lobe, which is a brain region that is, as we mentioned earlier, is typically larger in humans in proportion to other animals. That is responsible for things like speech, problem solving, abstract reasoning, planning, the higher cognitive functions that we mentioned earlier, the things that make us human, the things that allow us to reason deeply or solve puzzles. Those are believed to be associated with the activity of the frontal lobe. Then there's the parietal lobe, which is involved in planning movements or receiving information about our sense of touch, as well as doing things like math and reading. So, for example, if you go to stand up and walk around your room, it would be information from the instructions from the parietal lobe that are sent uh, through your brainstem down your spinal cord into the somatic nervous system to enable the transmission of the message to move your leg. Then there's the temporal lobe, which is involved in the recognition of certain stimuli like sound, smells, and the recognition of faces. And then there's the occipital lobe, which is involved in visual functions, interpreting visual information and tracking motion. There's this great website that I will post on our Canvas page, which is called neuroanatomy.ca. It's a page operated by some researchers out of the University of British Columbia, and it has some really great interactive modules as well as some quizzes to help you learn the different parts of the brain. And you'll see here that the different lobes of the brain are separated by some major sulci and gyri, notably the central sulcus, the lateral fissure, and the parietal occipital sulcus. You'll also see a view of the four lobes of the brain from the inside. So this is looking from, if you cut the brain in half down the middle, looking from the inside at their location. You'll also see the location of the limbic system, which is, once again, these are subcortical structures, so they're hidden inside the brain, beneath the cortex. So to say a little bit more about the limbic system, there are five main structures for you to know at this level that make up the functions of the limbic system. First, the thalamus. The thalamus is the sensory relay station of the brain. If the brain were like a city, the thalamus would be the central bus terminal. It's where all the information goes through. So information from your senses or from your fingers or from your toes will travel up your through the peripheral nervous system, up your spinal cord, and go through the thalamus before being relayed to whatever area of the brain it needs to go to. Visual information to the occipital lobe, sensory information to the parietal lobe, and things like that, or tactile information, I should say, to the parietal lobe. Then there's the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, which are both involved in releasing hormones and your stress response. There's the amygdala. If you can just associate one word with the word amygdala, just know that it's involved in fear and emotion responses. And then there's the hippocampus, which we'll talk more about in chapter 8, which deals with memory. Then there's the brainstem, as we mentioned earlier. It has three parts: the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. And these structures together help regulate your body's basic functions. Once again, these are unconscious things, things like making sure your digestion is operating properly, things like keeping your lungs, the muscles that control your lungs, keeping them moving and helping you breathe while you sleep, for example, as well as releasing hormones to help you grow and other parts of your development. So a quick quiz on everything that we've covered in this chapter so far. Feel free to pause the video to give your answer. Which lobe of the cerebral cortex is most likely to be active when you're trying to solve a complex puzzle? So here the answer would be A, the frontal lobe. That's where our higher cognitive functions, activity there allows us to accomplish things like problem solving and other higher cognitive functions. Second question, when you throw a baseball, the central nervous system sends information to the peripheral nervous system to execute the movement of your arm. The blank, a part of the brain, sends instructions through the spinal cord. The spinal cord then sends instructions to the blank, a part of your peripheral nervous system. Fill in the blanks. So the answer here would be B, the parietal lobe. That lobe of the brain sends instructions through the spinal cord, and the spinal cord sends that information to the somatic nervous system, which was one of the divisions of the nervous system.